The old schoolhouse up on the hill is full of memories of years gone by. I remember it all still, with its rustic look that will never die. Those long days of teaching the kids in that one room, their ages ranged from 5 to 18, who knew they were to learn soon. That old pot-bellied stove in the corner was never enough to keep us all warm, and that one little boy, always a loner, was never about to cause any harm. I hope I return someday again to recall how my teaching life began. The Battleground School District traces its roots back over 100 years to October 1908, when Dublin and Glenwood residents signed a petition to consolidate the two districts into a new central district. 3 new school board members, Peter Onsdorf, William Bramhall, and G.C. Scotton, met in April of 1909 to determine where to build a school building. They selected 2 acres on the northwest corner of Parkway and Main Street as the site for the new central school. With a budget just over $4,700, District 64 began operation in the fall of 1909. For the next 66 years, smaller districts would consolidate with Battleground until 1975, when Yacolt became the final district to consolidate with District 119. New schools were added along the way, including Prairie High School in 1979. History is full of dates and places, but it is best told by those that lived it.
In the early 20th century, there were a lot of little schools around. You had your little communities that were centered around a little country school or a church or whatever, and then a couple of miles or 3 miles down the road there'd be another little community.
People visited back and forth and helped each other. If you needed anything, you could call on a neighbor and know that you would get some help.
Yeah, there was all kinds of little districts around it. We lived in what they called the Beetree district. The school had been originally built back in probably 1880, and my great-granddad helped build that school. Shortly after the turn of the century in the 1900s, early 1900s, they built a new school at Beetree. My mother went to school there a little bit, and all my older siblings went to school there. And they were in school when it consolidated with Battleground in 1931. Then just down the road to the south and east was Charter Oak School. It was a little larger school. And there was Cherry Grove right out here, where the Cherry Grove Church is. A mile north of that was the Cherry Grove School. We lived right on the dividing line between Beetree and Fairview. In those days, there was no restriction. I mean, if you felt like going to this school, you could go to that school,
At that time, Brush Prairie had 8 grades and 2 rooms, a little room and a big room.
In those days, you were in the same room as the other grades, so you could hear everything that was going on, and if you were alert at all, well, you'd be listening to what she was teaching 2nd grade. And so when I got into 2nd grade, another little girl and I, she went to our parents and asked them if she could put us up in 3rd grade to keep us busy. So evidently we were disturbing her class.
But I started here in 1934 in 1st grade and went through the 4th grade in the old elementary building, or the old original schoolhouse. I had been taught at home, and I could read and write quite fluently when I went to school and do arithmetic. My sister taught me about all this stuff. She was a few years older than I was, and Miss Sly recognized this right away, and I was in there one day. And the next morning when I got to school, it was just a little while, and she took me by the hand and led me up the hall to, she said, "You're going to be in this room now with Miss Thomas."
We were both in Central, I think is what they call that building, on North Parkway, in the 2 little rooms that had the terrace.
The 1st and 2nd graders got out at 2 o'clock, and buses took them home. Then at 3:30, they took the other students home.
Well, you'd have rows, and then the teacher would teach 1st grade, 2nd grade. Of course, 1st and 2nd grade got out early, So we walked home earlier than the bigger, we called it the big room and the little room.
What I remember most about going to school was there was a platform outside in front of the steps. Everybody lined up in a rotation to where they were sitting. And you went left, right, into your room, and you was lined up in the right spot, you know, when you ended in there that you sat there.
It had several rooms downstairs and several rooms upstairs. At one time when that school was originally built, it housed even the high school from first grade through 12th. The first through the third grades were downstairs in the old schoolhouse when I started school. The fourth, fifth, and sixth were upstairs. You didn't go upstairs unless the teacher sent you up there for some reason, you know, to see the principal of the grade school, which was Mr. Durkee at that time. But I didn't have that privilege. I didn't have to go upstairs.
Mr. Durkee was the principal of the grade school, and he taught my class math. He was very stern gentleman, just absolutely scared me to death. But I learned lots of math that year.
We had electricity, but we did not have inside plumbing at Brush Ferry. And I guess there was a well because they had water in the sink.
The lavatories were outside in the building separate from the school. And it sure beat the ones that we had in grade school and Fifth Plain and Brush Prairie. They were the outdoor mountain type.
I attended Battleground 1 through 12. Didn't have K in those days. And I graduated in 1948.
My Central Elementary, that, as I say, the building is still there now, it was grades 1 through 6. And actually, I believe when I came along in what was the year 1948, they had added on to the building, and I was in the new portion. Jessie Shores was my first grade teacher.
There were a few male teachers, but mostly women. And the women that we had, the married women were not allowed to teach. Or at least they didn't get the jobs that the single teachers did. So mostly they were miss until I came to Battleground. Then we had misses, but both over there I had Miss Banbury. I think it was her first year. And she was Mrs. Miller when she came back and taught at Battleground.
Miss Sigenthaler in the second grade, she was a very active teacher, very good teacher, had something going on with the kids at all times.
I had 2 or 3 teachers that really stick out in my mind. One of them, Mrs. Lawrence, was my 6th grade teacher. She also taught her father. I mean, she graduated at Battleground in 1919. And because she was only 17, she went to college a half of a year. And then she was 18 and they could hire her, and she taught till she was 65. And she had 3 younger brothers, one of whom served on the school board for 25 years. And the youngest one spent 16 years pitching in the big leagues. And she was just as good an athlete as her brothers were. She played on the girls' basketball team in an era when they played colleges. She played against Pacific Lutheran University, College of Puget Sound. There were no other teams good enough to beat them. They beat the big city schools. And that was true clear through the 20s with girls' athletics in Battleground.
We had desks with a hole for the ink well to sit in. And one of the boys, who was Jerry Staley, by the way, he left his ball in that little hole. So Margie Sievert and she says, "Irma." And so I looked up and she threw the ball to me. And about the time that I threw it back, why, the teacher came in. And we both got X in deportment that time. And our parents were not pleased.
We had 2 girls sitting in front of us, and we was always doing something to them, you know. So in order to punish us, the girls moved one with me and one with the other. And man, that was something different, you know. Just had to sit with a girl.
I remember getting paddled in the 2nd grade by a teacher, and Unfortunately, my father found out about it.
And if you had a problem at school, you had a worse problem at home.
I had to eat standing up for a week. I couldn't sit.
The kids, when they came to school, were prepared to learn. They had been taught to listen and pay attention at home.
And if the teacher said it was so, it was so. We didn't
We
question.
didn't question.
We didn't question.
In the 4th grade, I had a wonderful teacher. She was here for many years. She had graduated from high school here, and that was Myrtle Johnson, Forsgren. And you've no doubt heard of Harold Johnson, who was a former principal and superintendent here. It was her brother, and they were brother and sister. And Myrtle was a real good teacher, and a very effective teacher with all the students.
Harold Johnson was another one. You didn't fool around in their class. And if you talked to anybody, oh, I hated that teacher. Well, most of those were the ones that were goofing off and not doing what they were supposed to be doing.
What made them a good teacher was their understanding of kids and handling of kids, even the problem kids, if there were problems. And I can't remember, in those days you didn't have too many problem kids because most of them were pretty well disciplined at home.
The class her mother graduated in, there were 32 graduates, and when they started as freshmen, there were over 100 students in the class. But the Depression just wiped them out. As a practical matter, boys simply stopped going to school.
I moved back and went to work here in town when I was 15 years old, and I never went to high school.
They stayed home and worked.
If they were 16 years old and they were offered 90 cents or $1 an hour to work in a defense plant, they preferred that over school. And this was the way it was back in those days.
It was just an economic thing. Eating came first.
And it was that way all over. And people were migrating from one part of the country to the other, just looking for jobs, riding on flat cars and railroad cars, you know, the only mode of transportation, hundreds of them on there, and you'd see them. And it was really rough.
If I look back at my pictures from 1st grade classroom, 2nd grade classroom back in that era, I mean, the kids are wearing shoes with holes in them. Boys were wearing bib overalls, and that wasn't a style thing. They probably owned one pair of pants that fit them, and that's what they wore 9 days a week.
Thing was that you didn't really spend much money just foolishly, because you couldn't. Times were tough.
And we didn't know we were poor. I
Yeah.
often think about that. There was one girl in our class who always had cashmere sweaters, but I never envied her. You know,
Yeah.
I didn't know I was poor.
Everybody had to walk. And I had, the first year I was there, I had to walk about 2 miles.
My dad took us we had a team of horses, and if it snowed hard, he'd take us in the sled. And then he'd make 3 or 4 trips around the schoolyards so the other kids could have riding the sled before he left.
There wasn't hardly very few people had phones. So we went to school regardless of how deep the snow was, you know. And nobody thought anything much about it.
Had a big stove in the room there that heated his room, and usually the teacher came, I guess, and built the fires. And of course we'd come to school soaking wet, or shoes would be wet, and we'd all take our shoes and socks off and sit by the stove, and she'd dry our shoes, and then we'd put them back on again.
If there was snow on the ground, that did not mean that we stayed home. Les Bodine and Kyle Spencer were in charge of the bus barns back when Battleground had their own buses. And we lived out in the country, of course, and there were hills in our area. And Kyle used to call Daddy and say, hey, how are the roads out there? That's how they checked to see if they were passable. And Dad says, well, they're pretty bad. He says, but I'm going to take the log truck out and run it up and down the hill so the bus can make it up and down the hill. So I was pretty proud of my dad to be able to do that for us. And we maybe had to take 2 or 3 runs at that hill with the bus, but we always made it, and we never went in the ditch.
The junior high was new when I was in the eighth grade.
And then we went to Battleground for the 7th and 8th grade.
It was attached to the high school when they built it. And there was 3 grades in the junior high, 7th, 8th, and 9th, and then I went to high school.
It was a little different, but as far as the conduct of the kids it was pretty much the same. You know, it was except that our classes was in separate rooms. 8th grade was in one room, and 7th grade was in another room.
I do remember our rally outfits in junior high. We had little bloomers on, and then our skirts unbuttoned up the side. And so when we cheered, our legs, of course, extended out. And I can remember the high school kids coming by and saying, "Oh my gosh, that's a little racy, isn't it?" But we had these blue skirts that were just, hung over us, and then our blue and gold was our colors, and then we had the gold bloomers underneath, and we thought they were kind of cool.
And one thing I enjoyed mostly was they had a gymnasium. And so I went out for basketball the first year, 7th grade, and I made the team, and same thing with 8th grade.
I think Mrs. Helms, my English teacher in Battleground, was probably, in junior high school, was probably one of my favorites.
Mrs. Helms, I enjoyed her. She was really strict, and if you missed something in a test, she came over there and said, "You know that, what is it?" Well, you knew it. But I enjoyed her.
At the time, why we thought she was very strict, but looking back on it, boy, if you couldn't get English from Mrs. Helms, you didn't get it.
I graduated from there and started to go to Battleground, and Zeller was the coach then at that time, and he went around asking the kids, who wanted to play baseball, and I wanted to play, so ended up being the catcher from only freshman to make the team.
I played football and basketball and baseball and had the lead in the junior class play and in the senior class play. And I was senior class president.
I played basketball and I made the team, the only freshman to make the team. And I played 4 years, and then I played football, the only freshman to make the team, and I played 4 years.
I have lots of good memories of this teacher and that teacher, especially Mrs. Engelman. She was a home economics teacher. She was great. She really went further than learn to sew a dress or learn to cook a meal. It was designing your home, decorating your home. She took us to buy furniture for a room in the new home ec building, and she taught us a lot of life lessons. She was my advisor for FHA.
I remember Mr. Forsman as my in freshman year, or 9th grade we called it then, and he was my Washington history teacher. And he today looks just exactly like he did when he was my teacher in 9th grade. And he was just excellent.
Pierre Roche was somebody, I don't care what he taught. He always taught kids. And, somebody would say, what's Pierre going to teach this year? I don't know what Pierre's going to teach this year, but it'll be kids.
And Oral Peru, an excellent music director. Just wonderful in the music department, and all the things he did for us.
I was hired by Pat Petticord. I was hired to teach physics. I was an assistant principal here. I went to Prairie when it opened. I served 10 years as an assistant principal between the two places with some other added duties. This also meant, since the people who were going to Prairie were picked ahead of time, at least the administrators were, you got to say something about what the layout was going to be, what the school was going to look at.
Zeller for science, and Goodrich for history, I think it was, and some other things.
Ralph Olmsted was my chemistry teacher, and when I took SAT tests in my senior year in high school, your scores were in percentiles. Mine were 55th to 65th percentile, except chemistry. I was 99th percentile. And it's the same guy taking the tests. The difference was the teacher.
I was part of the dancing majorettes with the band in the Rose Parades, and I served on many school activity committees, which at that time I was very pleased to receive a citizenship award my senior year.
She was FHA president.
And Girls Athletic Association vice president, I think, and pep club.
I took Latin so it wouldn't interfere with my football because we had to play during the school hours. And it was not during that particular time. That way I got a double period into athletics.
Well, we had a girls' league at that time, I remember that.
We did too.
And we had a yearbook group. I remember setting up art shows in the library over here so that we could get the idea of art out into the community. I remember setting up art shows downtown in Vancouver in the regional library down there when there was nobody, going out to the Kiwanis to set up an art show, where there was no place for people who did do art in the community to show their work, much less, kids have their work shown.
And it was wartime, and there wasn't a lot of time. There was a lot of things. There weren't a lot of things to do. There was a movie theater here in town.
They called it BG.
Yeah, BG Theater.
B-E-G-E-E. One of the girls, they had a contest to see about the name of it, and one of the girls in my class won the prize by naming it BG.
BG.
Mm-hmm.
A friend of mine, a neighbor boy that I was running around with, went to the movies one night down here at Battleground, and these two gals came in at the same time we went in, and they had come with one of the gals' parents, and the parents had gone on in, and we were standing out in the lobby talking, and we were outside the theater, out in the lobby actually. We talked for a while, and then we went in, and we sat together during the movie, and kind of got acquainted, and we went from there.
And then we had Campus Corner when I was in school, and I
Yeah.
don't think that was there.
It was not.
It
I
was
worked
a-
there
it was
after
a-
I was, I worked there at Campus Corner.
Did you?
Uh-huh.
That was a soda fountain, ice cream.
Ice cream.
And we started going together after a while, and we went together for 3.5 years or better, I guess, before we got married. I was 20 and she was 19 when we got married.
My first job was at Campus Corner, which was the local hangout for the high school kids after games and whatever activities were going on.
If they were on the corner of Parkway, North Parkway and Main Street.
I believe a hamburger was 35 cents. And there's a Tiger Special, which was an ice cream conglomeration. It was 45 cents.
And then we had another store called B and Don's across the street.
And there was Morgan's too.
Oh, okay,
Morgan's
and
had a
that's,
good store.
that's where kids would go.
Oh, there was Battleground Lake to go to, and the school functions, they used to have dances on different holidays and different things through the year, and they always had a homecoming dance for beginning of football, and a celebration there, and their proms and stuff, and then the school plays and musicals.
Having a car to drive to school was something that a lot of the children prior to my time didn't have the opportunity to do unless it was the farm tractor or something, but kids were starting to be able to drive to school.
We were on the way to a school dance, and a couple of kids came out and picked me up at Brush Prairie, where I lived, and they were going to stop and pick up somebody that was, they'd see him walking when they came over to my house, and then he was still there, and the kid put his brakes on too fast and flipped the car over. And it had a metal top on it, and they said, hey, good thing you were in that car with a metal top, because, yeah. So none of us were hurt, so we were lucky.
When I was in high school, I believe that's when the Russians first put up Sputnik. I believe we used to be able to go out at night and watch it in the sky. And I could remember the kids talking about that even at the high school basketball games.
In 1946, when our first basketball team in my high school years went to the state tournament, and going to Seattle was a major project, like about 8 hours. It was old 99 before the I-5
freeway was built, and that really expanded my horizons. I'd never been out of Battleground in Charter Oak before that time. That was a real broadening experience.
The tornado crossed the Columbia River down here and came across and it knocked down things, and that was all concerned.
The significant event that I remembered is the flood of 1948. It happened on our graduation night. So then some of us were looking for jobs in Portland, and to get to Portland, I went up through the Bridge of the Gods and back down on the Oregon side.
But it's that kind of things that you remember. Oh, the tornado, not the things that happen out in the big, wide, wonderful world.
I feel like I was very lucky to have gone to school where I did and when I did, in that I had a lot of really good teachers.
I taught Naha, Okinawa. I taught Schaffenburg, West Germany. I taught on the South Shore of Long Island. I taught in California. I taught in Seattle. I came back to Clark County, Washington, to raise my own kids. And I deliberately went to the Battleground School District.
Well, I thought they did a great job. They taught us everything they knew at that time.
I have never had any regrets about attending a school the size of the school that we attended. I have always felt like I was incredibly lucky to be in a school that was big enough to offer physics and chemistry and all these different kinds of classes, yet small enough that you knew every teacher and every student.
I wanted to have some control over curriculum, and you're much more apt to have control over your own curriculum in the Battleground School District.
And if I could go back and do it over again, I wouldn't go to school anywhere else.
We have about, a few over 20 left still living, and we have our 70th reunion this year.
96 of my classmates are still living, and way over half of that number would live within 30 miles of where we're sitting right now. And a lot of them were school teachers here.
I still see the kids that I taught, and they still hold me accountable for what I taught them.
Never in my life would have realized or had the opportunity, at that time, to do the things I've done in my lifetime, saw the places I've been to, which was the farthest dream I ever had.
I just think we were really lucky. The era and the place was a great experience.